November 12, 1897, Dawson City, Yukon Territory. The sun hasn't risen properly in 3 days, and it won't provide any real warmth for another 5 months. The air temperature is sitting at a deceivingly mild -10 degrees Fahrenheit. I say deceiving because the locals know what's coming. The Klondike Screamer, a pressure system dropping from the Arctic Circle, is barreling down the valley. On the north bank of the Yukon River, the sound of industry is deafening. Men are groaning under the weight of green spruce logs. Axes are biting into frozen timber. The smell of sawdust and desperation hangs heavy in the air. These men are building cabins. They are banking on tradition. They are banking on mass. They believe that 18 inches of solid wood is the only thing that stands between them and freezing to death. And then, 50 yards downwind, there is Silas Thorne. Silas isn't chopping wood. He isn't dragging 500-pound logs through the snow. He is standing on a ladder, holding a needle the size of a finger, stitching together what looks like a giant, pale shroud. You buildin' a kite, Thorne? The voice belongs to Caleb Miller, a man with hands like cured leather and a belief system rooted in brute force. Miller pauses, wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing air, leaning on an axe handle that has already splintered twice this week. It's going to be 40 below by Tuesday. Silas, Miller shouts, gesturing to the flimsy white fabric flapping in the breeze. That canvas isn't a home. It's a coffin. You're sewing your own winding sheet. The other men laugh. It's a nervous, jagged sound. They need to laugh because they are terrified. They look at Miller's rising log, wall solid, heavy, traditional end. They feel safe. They look at Silas Thorne's double tent contraption, a wooden skeleton wrapped in clothing. They see madness. Silas doesn't look down. He pulls the waxed twine tight, sealing a seam. Dead air. Caleb, he mutters, more to himself than the skeptic. It's all about the dead air. Miller spits a stream of tobacco juice into the snow, where it freezes instantly. Dead air is right. We'll come dig you out in the spring. Silas, if the wolves don't get you first? They mocked him. They called it Thorne's Folly. They called it the balloon house. But Silas Thorne knew something they didn't. He knew that in the laws of thermodynamics, mass does not equal insulation. He knew that the very logs they were stacking would soon become bridges for the cold. While his flimsy canvas tent was about to perform a feat of engineering that would defy the frontier's brutal logic. 3 days later, the temperature dropped to -40-2. And that is when the laughing stopped. To understand why Silas Thorne was willing to gamble his family's life on a few yards of fabric, you have to understand where he came from. Silas wasn't a trapper, and he wasn't a miner. He was a former shipwright from the naval yards of Bath, Maine. He had spent 20 years understanding how to keep water out and air in. He understood fluids, and in the world of physics, cold air behaves exactly like water. It flows. It seeks the lowest point. It pushes through cracks with hydraulic force. Most importantly, Silas understood the principle of thermal conductivity. The men in Dawson City were operating on the log cabin myth. They believed that wood was a perfect insulator. It's true, wood is better than stone. But green spruce, full of frozen sap and moisture, is a poor barrier against the Arctic. A solid log acts as a thermal bridge. The cold touches the outside of the log, travels through the fibers, and radiates into the room. Silas didn't have logs. He had canvas, but he had a plan to weaponize the air itself. His build was deceptively simple to the untrained eye, but strictly engineered. First, he built a light internal frame of two-by-fours over this. He stretched a liner of raw, unbleached cotton. This was his inner shell. Then, he built a second frame, exactly 6 inches larger on all sides. Over this, he stretched a heavy-duty, oil-treated canvas, the kind used for ship sails. But here is the weird secret that the neighbors missed while they were Silas didn't just layer the tents. He went to the base of the structure, where the canvas met the frozen earth, and he buried the skirts of both tents under 2 feet of heavy, wet sod, which froze into a concrete-like seal. He created a hermetically sealed envelope. By sealing the bottom, he killed the convection loop. If he had left the bottom open, air would have circulated between the tents, carrying heat away. By sealing it, he trapped a 6-inch layer of air completely still. In engineering, this is known as a dead air space. Stationary air is one of the most effective insulators in the known universe. It has low thermal mass and incredibly low conductivity. Silas wasn't living in a canvas tent. He was living inside a giant, human-sized thermos bottle. If you enjoy uncovering these lost survival technologies and the forgotten history of American engineering, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We dig into the archives to find the methods that kept our ancestors alive when technology failed. Now, back to the Yukon, where the mercury is about to bottom out. The storm hit on November 15th. It didn't start with snow. It started with the wind. The Klondike Screamer came down the valley at 40 miles per hour, stripping the heat off every surface it touched. Wind chill is a modern term, but the physical effect is as old as time. At -30 degrees, A 40-mile-per-hour wind strips heat away from a structure faster than a cast iron stove can generate it. Inside Caleb Miller's cabin, the mood shifted from confidence to panic. In the span of 6 hours, Miller had built a solid home, 12-inch logs chinked with moss and mud, but as the temperature plummeted to -35, the physics of the frontier began to dismantle his security. First, the logs shrank, wood contracts in extreme cold. As the moisture inside the timber froze and the fibers tightened, tiny hairline cracks opened up in the mud chinking. The wind, screaming like a banshee, found these microscopic openings. The draft in Miller's cabin didn't feel like air, it felt like a knife. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin was 42 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the wood stove glowing cherry red. They were burning wood at a rate of a quart a week, yet they couldn't get warm. The problem was the stack effect. The massive fire in the stove required oxygen. To get that oxygen, the stove sucked air from the room. That air had to be replaced. Since Miller's cabin wasn't airtight, the stove was literally vacuuming freezing cold air in through the shrinking chinking, dragging it across the floor to feed the fire. Miller's wife was sitting on the bed, wrapped in 3 wool blankets, her breath visible in the dim lantern light. The water in the bucket near the door had a skiff of ice on it. Add more wood. Caleb, she hissed, her teeth chattering. I can't, Miller yelled back, his hands trembling as he shoved another log into the fire. The stove is full, the heat is just vanishing. He looked at the walls. They were cold to the touch. The thermal bridging was complete. The logs were freezing all the way through. The safe fortress of timber had become a refrigerator. 200 yards away, under the flimsy canvas, the situation was radically different. Silas Thorne sat in a rocking chair, reading a distinct, well-worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. He was wearing a flannel shirt, not a coat, not a parka, a flannel shirt. His daughter was playing with a wooden doll on the floor. She wasn't wearing shoes. The silence inside the tent was unnerving. Outside, the wind was howling at hurricane force, battering the outer canvas shell. The fabric rippled and snapped, taking the brunt of the assault, but inside the inner cotton liner, stillness. The 6-inch gap of dead air was doing its job. It acted as a shock absorber for the temperature. The outer canvas was -35 degrees. The inner cotton liner was 65 degrees. That 6 inches of air was managing a 100-degree temperature differential. Silas stood up and checked the stove. It was a small, sheet metal airtight heater, half the size of the monster cast iron stove Caleb Miller was struggling with. Silas threw in a single piece of split spruce. Just one. Because the heat wasn't escaping, he didn't need a roaring inferno. He just needed a maintenance fire. Around 2 a.m., a frantic pounding shook the frame of the door. Silas had built a rigid wooden door frame into the canvas structure. Silas marked his page in the book, stood up, and unlatched the door. Caleb Miller stumbled in. He was covered in snow, his eyebrows frosted white, his face a mask of exhaustion and hypothermia. He had trekked the 200 yards because he thought he saw a glow through the canvas. He assumed Silas was dead, or that the tent had collapsed, and he had come driven by a mix of guilt and duty to check the wreckage. And instead, when Silas opened the door, Caleb was hit by a physical wall of heat. It smelled of coffee and drying pint. Caleb stumbled, his knees nearly giving out as the warmth hit his frozen face. He looked around the room. He saw the child playing on the floor. He saw the small stove. He saw Silas in his shirt sleeves. Caleb peeled off his heavy bear hide mittens. He reached out and touched the inner cotton wall. It was warm. How Caleb rasped, his voice cracking. My logs ... They're freezing through. The chinking is falling out. We're burning everything we have. Silas poured a tin cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and handed it to the shivering man. You're fighting the cold, Caleb, Silas said softly. I'm just asking it to go around me. Let's stop the story for a moment and look at the hard physics of why Miller failed and Thorne succeeded. This isn't magic. It's thermodynamics. We need to compare 2 critical engineering concepts, thermal bridging and R-value. Caleb Miller's log cabin relied on the thermal mass of wood. Softwood has an R-valued insulation value of roughly 1.4 per inch. A 10-inch log gives you an R-valued about R14. That sounds decent on paper. However, a log cabin is not a continuous membrane. It has thousands of linear feet of joints. As the temperature dropped to -35, the moisture content in the logs froze and expanded or contracted depending on the grain, breaking the air seals. Furthermore, solid materials conduct heat. The heat from Miller's stove radiated into the logs, traveled through the wood, and was stripped away by the wind outside. He was trying to heat the Yukon. Silas Thorne's system relied on the air gap. Still air that cannot move has an R-value of roughly 5.0 per inch, but that's only if it is perfectly still. By sealing the bottom with sod and the top with the overlapping canvas, Silas created a 6-inch gap. Do the math. 6 inches of dead air times R5 per inch gives you a theoretical R30 wall. That is double the insulation value of the solid log wall. But the real secret was the radiant barrier effect. The inner cotton liner was permeable. It allowed moisture from breathing and cooking to pass through, preventing condensation, the killer of insulation. That moisture moved into the air gap and vented slowly through the oiled canvas. In Miller's cabin, the moisture trapped inside condensed on the cold logs, turning into ice. This created a damp, chilling cold known as high-humidity cold. In Thorne's tent, the air was dry. Dry air feels warmer at lower temperatures. Finally, consider the BTU economy. Because Thorne's envelope was airtight, he wasn't sucking cold air in through the floorboards to feed the fire. His stove drew air from a small vent he'd installed near the base, creating a controlled intake. Miller's cabin was a sieve, replacing the entire volume of warm air in the room with outside air every 20 minutes. Thorne was heating a thermos. Miller was heating a wind tunnel. The morning after the storm broke, the landscape of Dawson City had changed. The snow was drifted 5 feet high against the north faces of the buildings. Caleb Miller survived the night, largely because he spent the worst hours of it sitting in Silas Thorne's rocking chair, staring at the canvas walls in disbelief. When the sun finally crested the mountains, bathing the valley in a pale, blue light, the camp began to stir. Smoke was struggling to rise from the chimneys of the log cabins, where men were chipping ice off their blankets. Silas and Caleb stepped out of the tent. The difference in the structures was visible from the outside. The roof of Caleb's cabin was covered in thick icicles, proof that heat was escaping through the roof and melting the snow, which then refroze the roof of Silas's tent. It was covered in a pristine, fluffy layer of powdery snow. There were no icicles. Why? Because the roof wasn't bleeding heat. The heat was staying inside. The snow on top acted as yet another layer of insulation, undisturbed by escaping thermal energy. Caleb Miller walked back to his cabin, gathered his wife and his children, and brought them to the tent. They spent the next week there while Silas helped Caleb retrofit his cabin. They didn't tear down the logs. Instead, they used Silas's method. They went into the woods, cut saplings, and built a frame around the log cabin. They stretched canvas over that frame, leaving a 6-inch gap between the logs and the canvas. They wrapped the house. Almost immediately, the temperature inside the cabin stabilized. The draft stopped. The wood consumption dropped by 60%. By January of 1898, you could walk through the outskirts of Dawson City and see a strange sight. Amidst the rough-hewn timber cabins, there were dozens of structures wrapped in white canvas, glowing softly like lanterns in the Arctic night. The men who had laughed at the balloon house were now sleeping inside copies of it. Silas Thorne's weird build wasn't a new invention. It was a derivative of the double-walled yurts used by nomads on the Mongolian steppes, adapted with the materials of the American Navy. Today, modern home builders call this a rain screen or a double-skin facade. If you look at high-efficiency skyscrapers or modern eco-homes, you will see an outer cladding separated from the inner wall by an air gap. It allows the building to shed wind and water while the inner insulation does the work. Silas Thorne wasn't a magician. He was just a man who understood that on the frontier, tradition is peer pressure from dead people. But when the frost settled, the only thing that shattered was their ego. If you want to survive the next deep freeze, maybe don't look at what your neighbors are doing. Look at what the shipwrights and the nomads did. I'm the frontier historian. Stay warm, stay smart, and I'll see you in the next storm.